Journals and diaries tell us a lot. They give us detailed accounts of events while also revealing some of our deepest, most personal thoughts. So when journals or diaries of lost people turn up, they're often the most revealing and gut-wrenching. These are the lost journals of explorers who never returned. Henry Hudson was a famous explorer from the early 1600s, known for his voyages in search of the Northwest Passage. His final trip in 1610 to 1611 was to find a shortcut through the Arctic to the Pacific Ocean. Hudson set sail on a ship called the Discovery and headed for what is now Hudson Bay. But things would go terribly wrong. As Hudson and his crew were stuck in the ice over the winter, conditions only got worse. Supplies ran low, and the crew started to lose faith in the voyage altogether. Abic Pickett, one of the crew members, kept a detailed journal that gives us a pretty clear picture of all the growing frustration and tension on board the ship. According to Pickett, the crew held out on shore over the winter, waiting for the ice to clear, and when it did, Hudson wanted to continue on, but the crew refused, insisting to turn back home, which, I agree. God damn, you spend a whole winter just waiting for ice to thaw, you've been stuck in the ice for all this time. I don't know how people did it back then, it's insane, but anyway, by June of 1611, the situation had boiled over to the point where the entire crew just mutinied against Hudson, taking control of the ship and leaving Hudson, his son, and a few loyal crew members in a small boat adrift in the Arctic. Hudson and his group were never seen again. The Franklin expedition is one of the most famous tales of disaster in Arctic exploration. In 1845, Sir John Franklin led a British expedition with the goal of finding a sea route through the Arctic known as the Northwest Passage. Franklin's ships, the HMS Erebus and HMS Terror, ended up getting trapped in thick Arctic ice. The ships were stuck and the crew had to deal with incredibly harsh conditions, and the situation worsened over time as food ran out and the cold only got worse. In 1848, after a year of being stuck, the crew abandoned the ships and tried to make their way across the ice in desperate attempts to find help. For a long time, no one really knew exactly what happened to the men. In 2014 and 2016, the wrecks of the Erebus and the Terror were finally discovered though, along with journals that revealed all these details about the absolute hell the crews had gone through. The records described their deteriorating health, the lack of food, the growing sense of hopelessness. Percy Fawcett, one of the most legendary and controversial explorers in history, in 1925 he set off for what would end up being his last expedition, to find the lost city of Z. He left behind a note stating that if he failed to return, he didn't want a rescue team sent, not wanting them to suffer the same fate as he and his small crew. Fawcett, his son Jack, Jack's friend Rayleigh Rimmel, and 2 Brazilian laborers, along with 2 horses, 8 mules, and a pair of dogs, set out on April 20th from Cuiabá, Brazil. Percy, Jack, and Rayleigh would never return. On the 29th of May, Fawcett sent a letter to his wife with their location, stating that he, Jack, and Rayleigh were about to enter unknown territory, crossing the upper Xingu on the Amazon River. That was the last anyone ever heard from them. It took nearly 2 years for the Royal Geographical Society to declare the group missing, and a search was launched, but there was no sign of Fawcett or his 2 companions. To this day, there are still all sorts of theories about what may have happened to them, like they were eaten, maybe they drowned, they could have been killed by tribesmen, or perhaps they found the lost city of Z, where they spent the rest of their days in secret, which is a nice thought, but highly, highly unlikely. Say that I starved, that I was lost and weary, that I was burned and blinded by the desert sun, but that I kept my dream. These were some of the last words penned by Everett Ruess, a young poet and artist who set off into the wilderness of the American Southwest in 1931, writing that he preferred, quote, the saddle to the streetcar and the star-sprinkled sky to the roof, the obscure and difficult trail leading into the unknown to any paved highway. He spent the next few years trucking around, selling his paintings of the rural landscapes to make money. Then on November 20th of 1934, he set out along with 2 donkeys into the Utah desert. never to be seen again. He told his parents that he was going to be gone for 2 months, but when 3 months passed with no word from their son, the authorities were contacted. All that was ever found were his 2 donkeys and his campsite at Davis Gulch, a canyon of the Escalante River. Some say he may have fallen off a cliff or drowned in a flash flood, but there were also stories told by several Navajo that Ruess had been killed by 3 Utes. No remains have ever been found though, so we'll likely never know for sure. I do not think we can hope for any better things now. We shall stick it out to the end, but we are getting weaker, of course, and the end cannot be far. It seems a pity, but I do not think I can write more. R. Scott, for God's sake, look after our people. This was Robert Falcon Scott's final journal entry in March of 1912. Robert Falcon Scott was a British naval officer and explorer who led one of the most famous and tragic Antarctic expeditions. His goal was to be the first to reach the South Pole. The team included a mix of experienced explorers and scientists. The journey to the South Pole was, of course, grueling. Scott and his team had to pull their own sledges through deep snow and ice, which was extremely exhausting, but the party did reach the South Pole on January 17, 1912. They'd finally made it. Only they were too late. After their long, perilous, grueling journey, they'd found that a Norwegian team led by Roald Amundsen had beaten them to it. The disappointment was crushing, but Scott and his men couldn't just stop and relax. Now they had to return all this way back home, and the return would prove to be even tougher. The weather turned against them, and their supplies were running low. Scott's last diary entries described the worsening weather, the growing sense of despair amongst the team, slowly realizing that they weren't gonna make it home. Scott would write letters to his team's families, his own wife, as well as one to the public that read, "We took risks, we knew we took them, things have come out against us, and therefore we have no cause for complaint, but bow to the will of Providence, determined still to do our best to the last. Had we lived, I should have had a tale to tell of the hardihood, endurance, and courage of my companions, which would have stirred the heart of every Englishman. These rough notes and our dead bodies must tell the tale, but surely, surely a great rich country like ours will see that those who are dependent on us are properly provided for." I always have to wonder when I read about this story, if they did reach the South Pole first and discovered that they were the first ones to do it, would their spirits have been higher? Would they have been able to make it home alive? I don't know. David Livingstone was a well-known Scottish physician, explorer, and missionary in the 19th century, most famous for his work in Africa. According to him, his journey into the heart of the continent wasn't just about spreading Christianity, it was about exploration. By the early 1870s, Livingstone was deep in the interior of Africa, near Lake Tanganyika. His goal was to map out the continent and find the source of the Nile River. But Livingstone's health was failing as he battled diseases like malaria and dysentery. But he continued his work, documenting his observations and experiences. His writings during this period are kind of a mix of scientific observations, detailed descriptions of African cultures, and his own personal fears and observations on his struggles with his own health. His last journal entries, written in 1873, were written in Chief Chitambo's village at Chipundu, where he eventually died on May 1st of 1873. His body was embalmed there, with his heart being buried by his followers under a tree, and today a monument dedicated to him marks the spot where he died. Salomon August Andrée was a Swedish explorer who set out to reach the North Pole in July of 1897, and his plan was to travel there using a hydrogen balloon. The expedition started with high hopes. Get it? Andrée and his team of 2, Nils Strindberg and Knut Fenkel, set off in a specialty designed balloon named the Ornen, or the Eagle. It didn't work out as planned. They were met with strong winds and freezing temperatures, and ice started to form on the balloon. And after just a few days, they were forced to make an emergency landing on the ice. The team then tried to continue their journey over the ice on foot, but again, things weren't easy. The wind was still rough, and the ice was constantly shifting. They were constantly veering off course and growing more and more tired by the hour. They finally reached land in October after more than 2 months, trekking over the ice. Their journals were recovered, which were a detailed account of the adventure, but the entries stopped just a few days after having reached land. Up until that point, they'd been fairly consistent. From this, it was pieced together that the team had likely died a couple weeks or even days after having reached land. In 1900, the keepers of the Flannan Isles Lighthouse off the west coast of Scotland went missing, and nobody knows where they went. It's still one of the eeriest and most mysterious missing persons cases to this very day. In December of that year, a ship noted that the lighthouse wasn't operating, and this information was passed on to the Northern Lighthouse Board, but a relief vessel didn't dock until the 26th. Inside the lighthouse, they found nothing, though. Nothing living, anyway. There was a full meal left behind on the table, as if they'd been about to sit down to eat before they disappeared. Their clocks were unwound and their beds weren't made. It looked as if they'd left in a bit of a hurry, but there was no sign of the keepers, James Ducott, Thomas Marshall, or Donald MacArthur. What had also been left behind, though, were their log entries, some of which were pretty strange. Marshall had written on December 12th that there were, quote, severe winds, the likes of which I have never seen before in 20 years. He also wrote that Donald MacArthur had been crying, which was strange considering MacArthur was a very experienced mariner. On top of that, he had a bit of a reputation for being a brawler and a tough guy. It would have been pretty strange for him to be crying because of a storm. The log entry on the 13th described the storm continuing to rage, and that the men started praying. Not only was it bizarre for these experienced men to have been so shaken up about a storm while they were safe inside a lighthouse, but there were no reported storms on the 12th, 13th, or 14th of that December. So, just what on earth caused these men to disappear? With all that said, I've been your host, James, and I'll catch you, yes, you specifically, in the next video.